Today, we're really excited. I'm really excited. We're making buttermilk biscuits and pie crust. Last week, we did two of the more really important methods of mixing when it comes to baking. We did the creaming method, which is really common for cookies and other basic baked goods, where you beat the sugar and the butter and the eggs really, really, really well, and then mix that with the dry ingredients. That's how you get nice fluffy things like good cookies. So that's our creaming method. We also did last week our muffin method, one of my favorites, where you mix your wet ingredients and your dry ingredients separately and then very gently mix them together, not over mixing, very carefully not to over mix with muffins. So this is another method. It's called the biscuit method, but it's also called in the cut in method. We're going to be cutting in the butter into the dry ingredients. And that is the way that you make biscuits and the way that you make really good pie dough. So that's why I wanted to combine these. We're going to have time to make the biscuits in full, have them in the oven baking. While that's happening, we'll make our pie crust. The pie crust is for you. You can make a pie tonight. You can make a pie tomorrow. You can also freeze this pie crust because next week we're going to be doing different kind of pies and fruit tarts with tart dough. So if you wanted to use today's pie crust next week and then not have to make a new batch, that's fine. I will be making a new batch because I want this pie tomorrow. So that I just wanted to let you know. So if you wanted to keep your pie dough for today, you can freeze it, wrap it really tightly, and roll it over until next week's class. But we're going to get right into this, the buttermilk biscuits. I sent out the recipe. This is the fun thing. I couldn't find buttermilk. I thought no doubt that wouldn't be a problem, but of course that was a problem. I found everything else. Well, I had everything else, but I couldn't get the buttermilk. This is the fun part. You can make your own buttermilk. And so I thought this was a great challenge. It was actually a happy accident that I couldn't find some because now I can teach you how to make your own and how easy that is. So if you were with me last week, and if you weren't, this is really important. I want to remind everybody the most important thing you can do, especially when you're baking, is to read the recipe in full from the beginning. Before you start doing anything, you want to make sure that that last step doesn't list something that you don't have or you can't do, or there's a piece of equipment that you might need, or basically just to sort of see how it all comes together. And in this case, it doesn't ever list anywhere in the method that you want to grate your butter and then refreeze it, but it does list it next to the butter. So we've got our flour, baking powder, salt, baking soda, all of our dry ingredients. And then it says 7 tablespoons of butter, chilled in the freezer, shredded on a box grater, and then refrozen. So that has to be part of your prep. You need to do that first, basically, because we want to get that butter back into the freezer while we're getting everything else ready so that that butter has time to get nice and really cold again. The main thing about the biscuits and the pie dough is keeping that butter from melting into the dry ingredients. You want it to stay whole but broken down, if that makes any sense. And you want it to be super duper cold because then when it goes into the oven, it's not going to flatten out. It's going to become really nice and puffy from the butter melting inside and creating air. So that's what we're going for. We're going to mix, you have to preheat your oven. 425, this is a hot one. They're only going to take about 10 to 12 minutes. Prepare your baking sheet. If you have parchment paper, that's great. I have one of these silicone mat things. I think I can show you here. Yep, Silpat. I like that because then I'm not wasting paper over and over and over again, but you don't have to have that. Parchment paper works great. If you don't have either of those things, just spray your baking sheet pretty well so that the biscuits don't burn on the pan. That's the only thing. But you'll be fine either way. They'll still turn out really great. So you got your oven going, your pan prepared, and then we're going to be mixing our dry ingredients in a bowl. It says using a pastry cutter or forks, you can cut in the frozen butter. I don't have a pastry cutter. I just use forks. It's really simple that way. It's how my grandma always did it. You're then going to add your buttermilk. We're going to form our dough, kind of fold it over and over. This is a really cool way of mixing it without over mixing it in the bowl. And then we're going to use our round cutters. If you don't have round cutters like these, you can use a small water glass maybe to punch out, or we're just basically going for anything about 2.5 inches in diameter, between 2 and 3 inches. So you can find like a small juice glass. Sometimes those little orange juice glasses are the perfect size. Maybe your kids have a little cup. Doesn't matter if it's actually a pastry cutter, just something round that you can even have square biscuits and just cut them into squares. Like, think outside the box, that's okay. And that is the entire recipe. So we want to get going mixing our dry. I've got everything already pulled out. That's definitely what you want to do. You don't want to have to go reaching into cabinets while you're doing things. So go through your recipe and get everything out onto the counter. We are adding 2 cups of flour. And again, if you haven't been with me, you really want to make sure that your cups are level. If I did this, which I think you can kind of see here, that's a very rounded, heaping cup of flour. That's not what the recipe calls for. The recipe calls for 2 cups of flour, so we want to make sure that these are even so we're getting the right science. So you can use a fork or like a wooden spoon, anything with an edge that you can just kind of scrape down that measuring cup on top and level it off like that. Make sure you get the right amount, 2 cups. Okay. Baking powder, salt, and baking soda. So this recipe calls for both of those types of chemical leaveners. They are chemicals, but they're good, naturally occurring chemicals. They happen in our body and in the world around us. Not all chemicals are bad. We're doing more baking powder than soda. Baking powder has more of a, creates more of a cake-like texture. Baking soda will give us those sort of nice crispy edges. So if you make more baking soda than baking powder, you're going to get a nice crispy crust or a good crispy edged cookie. And if you want more of a cake-like texture, the baking powder helps in that sense. So we want our biscuits to be nice and fluffy, so this recipe has more baking powder than soda. 2 teaspoons of the baking powder. You definitely want to use the edge of the jar where it gives you that lip there to scrape off your spoon. 2 teaspoons. Salt, 1 teaspoon. Now I never use coarse grain salt for baking. You always want to use fine grain, whether it's sea salt or table salt. I just use regular iodized table salt because it's the only time that I ever use it. And it's kind of a nice way to add that important thing into your body, which we all actually need a little bit of. But it's also because when people have worked out these baking recipes, they've worked it out with a small fine grain salt, not a thick grain salt. It's going to create a different saltiness to your food because those coarse grains have a different salt content in them. And so your measurement would be off. So definitely stick with small grain, regular grain salt. 1 teaspoon of that. 1/4 teaspoon of baking soda, just a little bit, but it's going to help give us those kinds of brown crusts and nice crispy bottom and edges. You want to scrape that off too. Usually you can use the side of the box. It has like that little lip on it. You can kind of scrape your spoon clean. All right. Your dry ingredients, it says whisk those together. You don't have to use a whisk. You've got your forks here already. You can just use your fork if you're using a fork. If you happen to have a pastry cutter, that's awesome. It's like a thing you hold on a handle that's got rounded like wire cutters, and you can kind of cut into it like that. If you have one, that's excellent. You should definitely use it for this. If you don't, that's cool. Use your forks like me. Set these things aside. I've got my dry situated. We're going to deal with our butter so that it can go into the freezer before we deal with all of our stuff here. Okay, I've got the butter in the freezer already, so it's super duper cold, which makes it a lot easier to grate. You just use a regular box grater. If you have a food processor with a grater attachment, you could put it in there. You just want to be really careful to pulse it and not work it too much so that it just melts again. You're trying to keep this so that it is very firm and very frozen throughout. So we need 7 tablespoons. This entire stick is 8 tablespoons. So I'm just going to peel the paper back to where my 1 tablespoon is left over, and I can hold that there. And then I'm just going to scrape down the side and grate this frozen butter. It seems like a really weird thing to do, but it makes such an amazing texture in your biscuits and pie. It makes it really flaky, really nice and layered, helps keep it from just becoming a solid hockey puck of flour. Nobody wants that. Make sure you're peeling that paper back as you go. You don't want to get any of that label into your food. Okay, we're getting close to where all I have left on there is the 1 tablespoon that's still wrapped up. Just making sure. And you can make sure by then putting the paper back on, I'm just going to see. That's still about a tablespoon and a half, so I want to make sure I'm getting everything that I need off of this stick of butter. The reason I use the paper to hold it is so it doesn't become so greasy that it starts slipping around in my hand. That can be very dangerous while you're using something like a grater. Okay, you want to get all of that butter out of there. You have this really interesting plate that looks like mozzarella. Don't eat that. I'm just going to stick it right in the freezer again. I made a little space. It's just going to stay in there, and it won't take very long. It didn't really melt very much. It's going to refreeze pretty quickly. I want to make this buttermilk now, just so that it has a few minutes. It only takes about 3 or 4 minutes to curdle and set up and come into the consistency that we want. So I want to make that while the butter is refreezing. And we're going to get all of this together. So the recipe calls for 3/4 of a cup of buttermilk to go into the biscuits and then a couple tablespoons extra maybe to brush on top. I'm just going to make 1 cup of buttermilk because that's the ratio that I know and it's easier to figure out that way. Then I can pour out 3/4 cups of that to measure into the biscuits and then use the rest for brushing if there's a little left over. Great. So 1 cup of milk. It should be a milk with a little bit of fat in it. I don't think it's going to work very well with a non-fat milk, but if you have a 1% or 2% or whole milk is the best. Milk, 1 cup of milk, 1 tablespoon lemon juice or white vinegar. If you have just basic distilled white vinegar or basic fresh lemon juice, and that's it. So 1 tablespoon of the acid content to 1 cup of the milk. Kind of mix it together and let it set for, like I said, 3 to 4 minutes. You've got buttermilk. That's how easy it is. We don't need to worry about people panic buying buttermilk. I don't really understand why that's out of all the stores, but there you go. So I'm just going to use my little juice squeezer and squeeze some of this lemon right into this tiny bowl. And then I can measure the 1 tablespoon out that I need. I just really want to make sure that the measurement is correct when you're doing something like this. The science doesn't quite work if you don't really measure it right. That's definitely over 1 tablespoon, so I can just measure out of this bowl. Make sure I've got a full tablespoon here. Yep. Right into the milk. So easy. Just give that maybe a little stir. That's going to take a few minutes. Set this over to the side. Let that do its thing. We need to use our pastry cutter or forks, and now we're going to cut in our butter, which should be pretty well refrozen. If you did that quickly enough and it's shredded finely enough, it shouldn't have melted and need to be completely refrozen. Should be pretty ready to go. I've worked in enough bakeries where plates and bowls of shredded butter have been left around like this, and people honestly think it's cheese and yeah, it's very funny. Dry goods, butter. We're going to be cutting in now. So I like to kind of make space for it. It's just going to all go right here in the middle. And then these forks I'm going to use to just sort of pull. It's like I'm shredding chicken or something, like if you're using the forks to crisscross against each other. Uh-oh. My screen went away. Something happened. Sorry. Okay, that's odd. Yeah, so I'm literally just like pulling these across each other as if I were tearing through, just using the forks to keep shredding and keep incorporating the dry with that flaky butter, but without like pressing it and working it and kind of crushing it. You're trying to just blend it together as if you imagine you had a pastry cutter, which are those like 5 sharp wires and a rounded edge. all that's doing is going through and kind of creating this coarse, sandy, it looks like gardening soil a little bit. I'll show you the progress. I don't know if you can see that very well. Yeah, it's just white flour in a white bowl. No, not very well. I'm going to pour this into a different bowl because I think for you, a lot of people, the issue here is like not knowing what it means when it says wet sand or what does this say? Coarse crumbs. That literally means like when you make soft breadcrumbs out of an old piece of bread and you grind it up in your food processor and it just sort of makes like thick, dry breadcrumbs. That's actually what we're going for here. So I really do want you to be able to see that. I think this bowl might work a little bit better. Let's see. It's kind of difficult in the phone situation, but you can see that it's still kind of crummy. It's not totally small, broken down into like fine-grained sand, but it's coarse breadcrumb style. I hope you can see that. So just a little bit longer, we're not trying to break this down completely, get that pretty well mixed in. It's gonna take a little tiny bit more mixing when we get the buttermilk in there, so we don't wanna overmix it. Just like those muffins, very important not to overmix this. Okay. Oh yeah, our buttermilk is curdled. We've got a buttery buttermilk here, which is really fun. It's so cool that it makes itself. We can make a well. Making a well in your recipe, in your bowl, you want to push the dry ingredients out to the sides, creating like a hole in the center. You're making a little cavity, a little well. That's where we're going to put our buttermilk. Oh, I almost messed up. I want to pour off my 3/4 cup of this buttermilk because this is too much. Kind of chunky, which is great. That's our extra for brushing or whatever. This is my 3/4 cup. Right into the bowl, right into that well we made. So that kind of keeps it all in the center. So you have like the pool of buttermilk right in the middle and it's not just spilling out all over this place. Then that makes it easier to bring the flour in from around the sides and just mix it until it's just mixed. You're gonna get a very shaggy, kind of wet, loose dough. And that's fine, that's exactly what we're going for. You really want to be careful not to overmix this. So I'm just going to use one fork first and bring flour in from the outside, gently mixing it into that butter flour mixture. Almost like to the point where I kind of want to stop. We just need to make sure that we have everything that would, it kind of sticks to itself in this very loose, shaggy dough. We're going to turn this out onto our cutting board, but first we need to put a little bit of flour onto our board so it's not completely sticky. Just use your hand, just dust a little bit out. Should it be covered because we're not trying to add a ton of flour into the recipe. It already has the flour that it needs. So we want to, I'm just going to use a spatula, make sure that you scrape all of this stuff out. And it's very loose. You'll see mine come out here. There's still a lot of floury bits and pieces out on the edges, and that's okay. It did not all come together inside the bowl. We don't want that. That would be very overmixed. I'm going to check the chat. I don't have anybody here to read things to me. If anyone has. Thank you for telling me about the camera. Yes, it was 1 tablespoon of vinegar. So it would be the same as the lemon juice. 1 tablespoon of vinegar or 1 tablespoon of lemon juice for that buttermilk. Same measurement. Okay, you want to put a little bit of flour on your hands. This is the fun part. This is when we get to play with our food and get a little bit messy. That's why I love baking. Just so that your hands are very dry and they're not going to stick to the flour too much because it is still pretty wet. There are going to be parts of this that are very wet. You're going to gather it together with your hands and very loosely just kind of keep patting it together until it forms a general rectangle shape. your rectangle looks a little bit more like an oval, that's okay. I'm not gonna come and judge you. We're just trying to get a general, like, elongated shape. See, it's definitely sticking to my hands. It's okay. A little bit more flour. Okay, once you've got it in this kind of rectangle, what we're going to be doing is folding it into thirds, which is interesting, I know. It's called a pastry scraper. It's called a book fold. This is very common in pastry making and croissants. So you bring one third over, and then the other third over. If you don't have one of these cool pastry scrapers, you can just use a spatula or your hands. The point is, it's going to be a little tacky right now. We're finishing the mixing process in this way so that it doesn't get overmixed and we get lots of nice flaky layers in our biscuit. Okay, we've got our book turn, folded over, pat down. You want to give this whole thing a half turn. Okay, so now it's elongated again this way. We're going to pat that back out into our nice rectangle. Flour your hands as needed. Sometimes if you get a lot of gook on your hands and it's not coming off, put a tiny bit of flour on your hands and rub it together, and then all that gook forms a ball and it comes off. Set that to the side. You don't want to put that in your food. And then just keep patting down. So you have another nice flat rectangle. You're trying to bring in the crumbs, bring in the edges, making sure it's all mixing together. Okay? I think my camera is kind of freezing every once in a while over there. Yeah, I'm sorry about that. I hope that fixes itself. I'm going to fold this again in thirds, the same thing. Pat it down. It's trying to connect. Sorry, everybody. So you do that third turn again. You're going to then turn the biscuits around one more time so that the rectangle is long ways again, and then pat that down. So we do this 3 times total. We're going to make that rectangle and fold it into thirds 3 full times. And that's going to be how we finish mixing this biscuit recipe. It's very different in that we don't keep mixing it in the bowl. We basically mix it by folding it over and on itself a few times. It also helps create those really, really flaky layers, which we definitely want in our biscuits. Okay, that was the last fold. And then I put it same way, long way, good floury hands, pat it out into our final rectangle. I'm really sorry that the phone's not reconnecting, but yeah, I will try to fix that in time for the pie dough. In the meantime, I just really want to get these into the oven. So once you've got it into your final rectangle and you've done your third book turn, you want to make sure it's not sticking, so kind of get it up off the board. Use your hands if you need to. And then we're going to reflour that board. You want to make sure that it's not sticking a lot this time because we're going to be patting it out into a good thin layer. We're looking for a 1/2 inch thick here. This is our final layer. We want to get about a 1/2 inch thick. You can use a roller. You can also just pat it down with your hands like I do. 1/2 inch general size is good. If it's not a 1/2 inch, then a little thinner would be better than a little thicker. You definitely want to make sure that you get all 12 biscuits out of this. Let's see. So we've got our rectangle. Everything is pressed out. I'm going to use my cutter and cut out my biscuits. I really do wish that you could see this. Hold on one second. I think I can log back in if you just give me 30 seconds. I don't know about you, but it is hot in my apartment, and with this oven on at 450, it is a struggle. 952. Sorry, guys. Hopefully this gives you a little time to catch up or clean up. I think this should work. Hoping. Yeah, okay, I'm back on there, I think, if you can find that. Yeah, because this is kind of one of the important parts of this skill. You've got this in your nice flat layer. You can see it's more or less a rectangle. Using whatever cutter you're going to use, whether it's a juice glass or an actual cutter, you just want to be really careful and thoughtful about getting as close to that edge as you possibly can. We don't want to waste this dough. You find that kind of corner and you get one out of that, and then you cut as close to that first cut that you made as you absolutely can, getting right to the edge. And then that way you're really going to get all the biscuits that you need out of this. Plus then we don't need to rework the dough very many times. We can put the dough back together and re-pat it back out and get more biscuits out of it, which we might need to get maybe one or two, but we don't really want to do that just because that creates an overworked dough again, and we want to avoid that as much as we can. So the point is to try to get your cutter as close to each edge and each other as you possibly can. Yeah, I didn't make this rectangle as wide as I should have because then I could have gotten a couple more out of it. I'm going to get 8 out of this cleanly. And then I'll show you to gently bring your biscuit dough back together, because this would be a waste. This is at least a couple more biscuits here. You want to be really careful, though, about over mixing. So you're just going to gently kind of pinch the seams together, gently bring it in and create another little rectangle, and then pat that together, pinch the bottom. You know, make sure that you're kind of trying to form it into one mass, but really gently. You're not over mixing this or working it together or kneading it together. We want to avoid that kind of stuff when it comes to this. You want to keep it really light and flaky. Pat this out. It's great. I'm definitely going to get my 4 more out of this, and we'll get these in the oven. Yeah. Okay, we want to brush the tops of these with some of our leftover buttermilk. If you were making this for a dessert, like let's say you wanted to make buttermilk biscuits for a strawberry shortcake or something like that, or you were going to serve this, I don't know, with berries and cream or something. My grandmother used to make the same biscuits for everything, dessert or breakfast or whatever. So you could just brush the top with the buttermilk like we're going to, and then sprinkle with a teeny tiny bit of sugar on top, and that would just take it. You now have a dessert biscuit instead of just a regular buttermilk biscuit. All right, voila. We have our 12 biscuits, more or less the same thickness, size, and shape. We want to put them on our prepared pan. You definitely want to give them space, although they're not going to like spread. So it's not that big of an issue. You just want to make sure you get all of them out onto this one tray. Excuse me. These are going to go in that 425-degree oven for about 12 minutes. Although I like to set my timer for about halfway through and then rotate the cooking tray. We're going to spin it around in a 180-degree circle so that each biscuit gets a good even cooking in your oven. Most ovens are a little inconsistent, like one side will be hotter than the other, the front will be hotter than the back because the heat's trying to escape. So we want to take our little pastry brush. If you don't have a little pastry brush, you can just use your fingertip and dab it on the top. Literally just kind of brush over and coat the top of each biscuit. This gives it a really nice golden top. You could do an egg wash, but then you're adding egg to this and it doesn't need it. Just a very light brushing so that it goes in and has that golden brown color and gets kind of a good buttermilk crispy flavor on top. Okay. Once this goes in the oven, we're going to be able to break some of this stuff down. All we're doing now is then making our pie dough, which is going to be very similar to what we did, except even easier in terms of the ingredients we're using. This goes right in the oven. You want to bake it in the middle of the oven. So most ovens have about 4 or 5 racks. Find that one right in the middle so that there's just as much space above and below your tray. If it's too close to the bottom's going to get really burnt. The bottom cooks faster than everything else, which is another reason you want to use a light colored cooking tray. If you're using a dark coated baking sheet, then you definitely want to use parchment paper or a Silpat for that, because that dark coating can actually cook it faster. So that's something to think about depending on the pan that you have there. I'm going to get a couple of these things set to the side and get my new bowl, get ready here. I'm going to set my timer, 6 minutes-ish. Then we'll turn those biscuits around, check them, make sure everything's working really well, and move on from there. In the meantime, we can get started on our pie dough. The pie dough, if we read through this, is very simple in terms of ingredients and steps. It's just making sure you really do it correctly and keep that butter cold and keep that ice water icy, and not overwork it, again, like those biscuits. Then that's how you can mess this up. It's not really fancy ingredients or fancy equipment by any means, but not having the right temperature of things and not paying attention to how gentle you're being can be that's how pie is not really as easy as they say. Pie is very difficult. So if you can make a good pie crust, which I think you can if you do this, follow this pretty well, then dessert is easy. As pie, get it? Oh my gosh. Okay. So we are going to, this is the same cut and method. So just like we just did with our biscuits, we're going to be mixing our flour and salt together. Those are our only dry ingredients. We don't need any leavening. We're not trying to get a rise out of this. It's supposed to be a very thin crust. So our flour and our salt, and then we're going to cut in our frozen grated butter, and then we're going to gently mix in some ice water, and that's pie dough, ladies and gentlemen. So I want to get the butter done first, like we did, so that it can go back into the freezer. This time it is a half a cup, so that is the whole stick of butter. Got our box grater. I'm going to go right on that same plate. So since we're using the entire stick this time, we're going to get to the point where I can't hold it with the paper anymore, and that's okay. Once you get down to like the last tablespoon or so of the butter, you can maybe just chop it up with a knife. Just be gentle with yourself. Don't do anything on the box grater that's going to cause you to cut yourself. You want to be really careful. So we're going to grate it as much as we can, and then I'm just going to kind of rough chop the last little bit, because I've cut myself in a lot of different ways. I almost lost an entire finger from a knife, but that is nothing compared to the pain of a grating cut. So don't grate your fingers. It's horrifying. Okay, this entire stick, we're going to grate it and get it right back into the freezer quickly. Even maybe more important than the biscuits, the pie dough relies completely on the proper temperature of these ingredients and you keeping it cold while you mix it. So if you started with, even if it was cold from the refrigerator, your butter would be pretty much room temperature by the time you started to mix it. So when you start with frozen butter, you're giving yourself a lot more chance to come out with the right kind of an outcome. Okay, I'm getting to that point where I don't want to hurt myself. So I'm going to stop. I'm going to get a knife. And again, I'm just going to kind of rough chop this like as if I was making little shreds. I'm going to try to do this quickly so that I can get this whole batch back in there. The more I touch it with my knife or my fingers, the more it wants to start melting. I get all of this out onto the plate. Don't leave too much of it in the box grater, then your measurements will be off. If you want to use an alternative butter, you can definitely do that. There's, there's margarines and things. If you have health concern about real butter, it would work pretty much the same. You can do this with vegetable shortening, which is the really old-fashioned way, and that would work out really well. You would just have to change the quantities a little bit, so talk to me if that's something that you want to try. We can talk about that later. Get this back into that freezer, just so that it sets right back up really quick. Could you put the leftover dough in the fridge to cool? For the biscuits, yeah. Do you want the baking sheet coated? Yeah, for the biscuits, the baking sheet should have had a little bit of pan spray on it, but mostly it should have had the parchment or like I used the baking thing, but a tiny bit of pan spray would have been fine too. Sorry, I didn't see that right away. You can put the leftover dough in the fridge to cool. For the biscuits, I'm kind of not understanding the question just in terms of so it doesn't get too overworked and soft in your hands. Absolutely. That is something that we do when we're doing large batches of dough, especially you want to, like, you're making 3 times this amount of biscuits, break it up into smaller batches and keep it in the fridge and then kind of trade off what you're working with, things like that. You can absolutely I'm not sure if you're asking also about the pie dough that's going to be left over. That wouldn't last a full week in the fridge if you are making this for next week. I'm answering 2 questions because I don't know which question is being asked, but yes, you can refrigerate the leftover dough from the biscuits and then make more. Absolutely. The pie dough that we're making, if you wanted it to last the full week until next class, it won't last in the fridge. It'll start to turn kind of gray. So you don't want that. I think that we lost my phone again. I think that it just keeps overheating maybe is the problem. It's very hot in my apartment right now. Okay, this pie dough though is the simplest thing. We've got our butter refreezing. Oh, now it's back on. Okay, it's just gonna keep doing that. 1 1/4 cups flour. Very simple, but just like everything else, you wanna make sure that it's a level measured cup, not overflowed, not under, full cup, and then a full 1/4 cup. And again, even with the little one, you want to make sure that it's completely level, perfectly flat. That's 1 1/4 cup. I'm going for a 1/4 teaspoon of salt. It's not very much at all. You want to use that fine grained salt again. Teaspoons. Oh. 1/4 teaspoon is the littlest one, usually, unless you have one of those cool sets that goes all the way down to an 1/8 or a 1/16, which is basically just a pinch. Okay, 1 level 1/4 teaspoon of salt, and that's it. So you do kind of want to mix that together so that the salt gets evenly dispersed in the flour. Okay, and then we are going to add our butter. The same exact thing that we just did with the biscuits. So you're going to use the pastry cutter or those forks. Woo! Timer. So we just want to spin our biscuits. We're just literally spinning the front of the tray to the back of the tray, giving it that good 180. And we're going to reset the timer for another 6-ish minutes. The total is about 10 to 12 minutes. It really does depend on your oven. You're looking for a very golden brown bottom and a slightly golden top, and the smell will smell like biscuits, and you can kind of tap the bottom and it'll look like, it'll sound a bit hollow. That's also how you can tell it's very done. But you need about 5 to 6 more minutes, depending on your oven. I'm going to use my forks. I'm going to cut in this butter right into this flour and salt mixture for this pie dough. All right, and just again, I'm using these like cutters. I'm just scraping them around, scraping the butter into the flour mixture, gently cutting it in. It's going to look like those, yeah, like fresh breadcrumbs, as if you cut a bunch of baguette or something and all the crumbs left over on your cutting board, or like sandwich bread pulsed up in the blender. That's what we're going for. And if you make stuffing for Thanksgiving, it's sort of like the bottom of the bag of the stuffing mix, you know? It's a kind of crummy, dry, coarse mixture. It looks, some people call it wet sand. If you go to the beach and you play with wet sand and pick it up and throw it around, it kind of looks like that. Very simple. We want to stop and not overmix it just until it looks the way that we're going for. I know that white bowl doesn't help. And then we're going to add in a 1/4 cup of ice water, 1 tablespoon at a time. And there's not very many things that I would require or ask that you do, like really tedious things like this, but this is one of those things. Very important that you do it this way because you can overmix it very easily. Sometimes you don't need this entire amount of water. Sometimes you just want to make sure that it's coming together well without getting too soaked in one area. I'm just going to put ice in this 1/4 cup measurement and fill it with water. Kind of melt the ice down, sort of. I'm going to let that melt itself in this cup. I know that I have generally the right amount, and then I'm going to pour 1 tablespoon at a time and add that 1 tablespoon at a time. We're going to mix in each tablespoon individually. This is where it gets a little bit tedious, but you don't want to rush this. This is one of those things in baking you want to really pay attention to and be meticulous. This is how you get a really nice flaky pie dough without having a very over mixed and chewy pie dough. It was unfortunate. It's nobody's fault. I didn't like pie for the majority of my life, because I thought that pie dough was always dry and not fun. It was just not really made right, and I think that was because we often had pie from, like, you know, we didn't make pie at home much. We ate out. We made a lot of graham cracker crust pies in my life, so that's kind of where I lean towards that. But this recipe made me like pie dough again. So, starting to get down there. The ice hasn't completely melted. I can pour up a little bit more of this water. It's mostly melted. There's a teeny tiny ice slivers still in here. They're going to melt as they work into the pie. So I'm just going to actually put the rest of this in. Make sure that I'm not overloading it with more than about a tablespoon. No, not just because it's going to melt in here. We want to make sure that everything gets mixed in really well. It's not going to form a very solid dough in this bowl. We are going to have to form it a little bit out on the on your work surface, so you need to put a little teeny bit more flour out, not much, because this is a very dry mixture. So in fact, you don't need to do that. If it's the same work surface you've been working on too, then you especially don't need to do that. But we're going to stir this in. We're gonna form it into a ball. That's what we're kind of waiting for. You won't really ever do that with the forks. What I've got here is this really nice coarse, oh, I can't show you there, here. This sort of coarse, sandy, gravelly looking thing. That's going to form a nice ball as I bring it together with my hands. So now all I'm doing is I'm pressing it against the side of the bowl and gently squeezing it until it starts to kind of come together. That last little bit of water, you just kind of really need to, you're forcing it. This is just enough water to get this amount of dry ingredient to stick together. And so you really need to kind of force it together. But again, not really mixing. You're just sort of using your hand to squeeze it into kind of a shaggy, loose ball. I'm going to turn it out onto the board and hopefully you can see that. Let's see. My phone is off again. I apologize. I'm going to have to figure out how to keep that cool enough while I work so you can all see it. It is definitely like a loose, kind of shaggy dough still. It's still definitely not completely together. I'm going to gently squeeze it and push it together on the board. And it kind of forms itself. That's all you want to do. You're not trying to make this look like a smooth, shiny dough of disc necessarily. You want it to all stick, but you don't want it to be completely like kneaded. We're not kneading it. We're just kind of binding it. Maybe flip it over, turn it over, just kind of gathering up any of the loose crumbs on the board. If you can see little specks of butter, that's good. We want that flakiness to build up inside of there, because then when it breaks down and melts in the oven, we get those individual thin layers created by the air that's coming out of the melting butter. The steam that it creates inside there is what kind of builds up the extra layers. So even in a very flat crust like a pie dough, you can get that flaky concept without even having any leavening in it, just because of the steam reacting and melting from the butter. So, oh, it's back on. Oh, good timing, because you can see this little disc that I've made. That's it. You're gonna wrap that very, very tightly in plastic wrap and put it in your freezer. If you plan to use it this week, like tomorrow or tonight or right now, then you would roll this out thin, about 1/8 of an inch thick, pretty thin, and roll it out with a pastry roller, a dough roller, and then line your pie sheet with it if you're making a pie. This is enough for 1 9-inch pie shell. It's not going to make a bottom and a top. It's just the 1 inch, the one layer. So that's all we need. If you are going to use it now or soon, then still wrap it really tight in plastic wrap and just leave it in your fridge until you use it in the next couple of days. If you're not going to use it until next week or a few days from now, then you want to freeze it, just because, like I said, it'll turn gray. It'll start to oxidize. It won't really have quite the same texture. So freezing it kind of keeps it in this state of more freshly made. So that's why I would recommend that. Our timer went off. We want to check our biscuits. Oh yeah. Okay. Move this pie dough over, obviously. I do not want to melt that. But I want to put this down here so I can show you the color that we're going for. So these are very hot. Don't do what I'm doing. These just came out of the oven and they're extremely hot. My fingers don't do this. You can see this on the bottom though. It's a really nice, like a dark honey, golden brown. Okay, that's what you're going for on the bottom. And you can see that the top has gotten that kind of haystack kind of golden brown. And that's what you're going for on top. And these are oh man, you can see, can you see that? Like the layers of flakiness? Yeah. All those layers, that's what we were going for with all that folding technique. That really helped build that up. If you really wanted to have a very tall, thick biscuit, then you would just make this batch and you would only cut it, you would flatten it out into a thicker rectangle and cut out thicker ones. But these are really great. They'll split open nicely, and I'm, You can make a healthy gravy. You can fill it up with, like I said, make them a little sweet with buttermilk and sugar on top. Serve it with strawberries and whipped cream. They're really great just on the side of like a dinner. Delicious to go with a lot of different things. I think that I want to, when it gets time and you're ready to eat one, sorry, I'm dropping things. You don't want to cut them. You want to take a fork and find that place where it splits. Oh, my phone went out again. Sorry, guys. Find one of those places where it's got layers in the side and just stick your fork into the buttery layers and kind of pull it apart. That's how you open up a good biscuit. Oh, man. It's going to be great. Okay, I need to set these aside to let them cool. If you have a rack to cool things on when you're baking, that's always the best because then the air can circulate and they'll cool down a lot faster. So that's what I'm going to do with that. But very important that we get our pie dough put away. If you haven't done that like I didn't, you want to make sure that that happens before that butter starts to melt too much inside the dough. So very tightly wrapped in plastic, which means this is a weird plastic. Use my big industrial commercial plastic. There we go. Lay your plastic out flat, put your disc of dough into the plastic, press it down flat, and then wrap it over it and wrap it around really, really, really tightly, like you're wrapping a blank present or swaddling a baby. Like wrap it really snug and wrap each layer around itself, and then tuck it in, maybe wrap it twice. You want to make sure this air seal is very, very tight. And that plastic contact around the outside of the dough is going to really help make sure that you don't get like a dried out skin also. So this is going to keep it really nice and supple and fresh and ready to work with. When you are freezing it, you need to pull it out the day before for it to be ready for the next day to use it. You can pull it out and maybe I would let it defrost in the fridge. That's the safest way to let any of your food defrost. It's the healthiest way. And then the next morning, if it's still frozen solid, pull it out onto the counter and let it start to come up before class or before you want to start using it to bake with. So that's for the dough. I'm going to put mine in the freezer. I'm probably going to make a pie with it tomorrow or the next day and then make a fresh batch for class next week. Just so that if any new people join us, they can get the same experience. But like I said, if you don't think you need that pie dough in the next couple of days, then save it for next week. It'll be great to use for our filled pies. We're going to be doing filled pie and fruit tarts. Fruit tarts are going to require a slightly different dough, but similar process, even more care we need to take to not overmix. And we're going to be doing a cooked lemon curd and fancy fruit topping, and I'll teach you a little bit about assembly. We'll start getting into some of those like pastry art skills, which is really fun. I'm really stoked. I've got biscuits for breakfast for the next couple of days. It's one of my favorite things. If anyone has any questions that I didn't get to, any tips on rolling the pie dough out? Yes. Okay. You can flour your cutting board until kingdom come, and all you're doing is adding more and more flour to your pie dough, and you don't want to do that. That's how you can get a really dried out consistency. So laying out a sheet of like good heavy duty plastic wrap like you saw I just used, or parchment paper, and rolling out on that. Then you can kind of lift up the paper and maneuver it a little bit. That should still be well floured, so you're rolling it out. But then you've got it on a surface that you can pick up, kind of put the dough from the paper onto the pie sheet by kind of turning it over or turning the paper over onto your arm and then bringing the dough over. I'll show this next week, the technique of like filling the pan. But if you're going to do it this week, you want to roll it out on something like that so that it doesn't stick to your cutting board. If it sticks to paper, you can always just kind of scrape it off and restart. It won't stick as much. That's kind of the fun part. If you have a well-floured area, if you're doing it on plastic wrap, you can put it in between two sheets of plastic, like plastic below and plastic above, and roll on that. You can do that with parchment paper as well, so you have 2 layers and then it doesn't stick to your rolling pin. You're just, don't worry about making it like a perfect circle. Just worry about that width more than anything, because too thick of a pie crust is really not great. So you want it to be as thin as you can without it really ripping or tearing or not being there at all. So yeah, about 1/8 of an inch you're looking for, maybe give or take. And rolling it out on the paper is one of my favorite ways, because then you can kind of twist and turn the paper around and get that shape worked out a little bit. If you have raggedy edges, that's okay. As long as it drapes over the side of the pie plate, you're just going to tear those off anyway. If you have some scraps, I would re-roll those and use those to maybe decorate the top with some lattice or something like that if you're going to get into making this before next week. Rolling it out can be kind of tedious, having a little bit of flour, not so much that it's absorbing tons more flour, but having flour on the surface, on the rolling pin, maybe using that top sheet of paper instead, that really helps with the sticking process. And then you can kind of lift it off the paper by flipping it onto your arm and then laying that onto the pie plate. There's videos on how to do that exact technique online, and in fact, I think our recipe of the week that we're going to be posting soon this week is a chicken pot pie in a skillet, and I show how to do that in that video. But you can definitely look that up. Like, it's called draping the dough over your arm, and then you drape it back over the pie plate. It's a good way to, once you've gotten it off of the part, you can get it off the surface easier onto your arm and then drape it back over. It's sort of a technique, but it actually works pretty well. Sort of a pizza dough technique. That was a good question, because if you are going to be making pie through this week, yeah, the rolling it out can be kind of annoying because you don't want to add too much flour, but as long as you use a little bit of that paper or something like that, that'll help go a long way. Would the frozen blueberries or fresh strawberries work well with this crust? Yeah, you could totally make a berry filling out of frozen berries. You kind of want to cook them down a little bit before you make a filling with that stuff, because there's a lot of liquid in frozen berries. So if you just like put that into your pie crust with some sugar or things, you're going to get a soggy bottom. And if we all know Paul Hollywood, we know that that's not what we want when we're baking or making pastries. So you kind of need to cook out some of that liquid when you're dealing with frozen fruit or frozen berries, but that's perfectly fine. You can make an amazing filling out of frozen berries. I have a ton of apples from the farmer's market that I'm going to be using up, and I have frozen blueberries. So I'm going to be mixing that together to make an apple blueberry filling. If anyone is super interested in what pie I'm going to be making with my pie dough this week, I can send you guys a recipe. Just email me if that's something that you think you might want to do before our next class. But like I said, our next class is going to be those pies. So we can make our pie together if you want to wait. We're going to be doing a filled pie and a fruit tart, like I said. So lots of fun stuff coming up next week. I'll send out a basic list of ingredients, but now that you know what goes into our pie dough, the tart dough gets a little bit of sugar. In fact, the dough that we're going to be making, I think, is called pâte sucrée, which is called sugar pastry. If I know my kitchen French well enough, I think it's just sugar dough. And it's very lightly sweetened, actually. It's not what Americans would think of as a sugar dough. It's kind of more of a shortbread pie crust. So we're going to be making pâte sucrée for our tart dough. And if you have a tart pan, I have little mini tart pans, like the fluted edge ones with the bottom that pops out. I'm going to be using those, so I'm probably going to be making about 4. If you have a full tart pan, great. If you don't worry. Please don't buy anything special. It will work just fine in a pie plate. So like a regular 9-inch pie plate, you can make a fruit tart in that just fine. The fun part about making it in a tart pan is it has that bottom that comes out. And so you can get your tart out of the pan without having to cut into it first or ruining your crust or your nice edges. That's sort of the only reason that was ever invented. If you have a spring form pan, which is usually made for cheesecakes, but also has a removable bottom, you can make a tart in that. You just make it very shallow towards the bottom of the pan, but it'll, as long as it comes out, you could definitely make that work. That's a good MacGyver type situation for a tart. But like I said, please don't worry about equipment. If you just have a regular pie plate or like a cake pan, you can kind of make it in anything. You just then have to cut it inside the pan. You can't get it out of the pan for service. That's the only thing there. If you do have tart pans, then dig those out of your storage somewhere. Basic ingredients, if you want to do this before I send out the email. The tart dough is pretty much the same as the pie dough. I think maybe we'll have like an egg and some sugar as the addition. And then we're going to do lemon curd, which is lemon juice and egg yolk and a little bit of sugar. And then we're going to do fruit on top. So berries, and it's stone fruit season, my favorite. So peaches and nectarines and cherries are out right now. Whatever your favorite fruit is, if you want it to be entirely strawberries, go to town. Just that's up to you. So that's for next week. I hope you enjoyed biscuits and pie dough today. If there's any other questions, you can email me or hit me up on the gram, as they say. Yeah, we're a couple minutes past, so I'm gonna stop the recording. You guys are awesome. I hope you had fun. I hope you made stuff. I'm sorry again about my phone. I'm gonna have to set up a little air conditioning system for it or something. Yeah, and if you baked anything today, or if you're continuing to bake later tonight or tomorrow, please send me pictures. It makes me so happy and proud. And if I can share it on our Instagram account, then let me know, all right? And yeah, if anyone has anything now, all right? Thank you. It was really great for you all to be here. I love this class. Thank you so much. If you haven't signed up, tomorrow morning is breakfast from 9 to 10. We're going to be doing International Pancake Day. We're going to be making fluffy American buttermilk pancakes with our new homemade buttermilk recipe. We're going to be making French crepes, and we're going to be making Dutch baby German pancakes, my favorite. So sign up for that class if you haven't already. Tell your friends, and I will see you all very soon. Thank you.